Hello, and welcome to The Brief Insight, your go to podcast for breaking down the latest trends, research, and policies shaping our world. Whether you're passionate about sustainability, global economics, or emerging innovations, this is where we simplify complex ideas to keep you informed and inspired. If you enjoy what you hear, don't forget to like this episode, subscribe to our channel, and share it with anyone looking for insights that matter. We're here every Monday and Friday, so hit that notification bell to stay updated. Your support helps us grow and continue bringing you sharp, relevant content that sparks conversation. Thank you for tuning into The Brief Insight. Now let's dive into today's topic.
Okay, so you sent over a ton of stuff about Sweden.
Yeah.
And their changing approach to migration.
Mm-hmm.
It's a lot. We've got opinion pieces and historical overviews and even some hard data.
Right.
Perfect for a deep dive.
Yeah.
We can see you're really interested in figuring out not just what's happening, but also why.
Mm-hmm.
Why is Sweden making these changes and what might happen next?
For sure.
So Sweden, long seen as this kind of humanitarian haven,
Right.
is now offering immigrants up to $34,000 to leave.
Wow.
It's a pretty big shift.
Yeah, it is.
But as we dig into this, I think we're going to find a more complex story than the headline suggests.
I think so too.
What's so fascinating here is how this challenges the common perception of Sweden.
Yeah.
Because Sweden wasn't always a migration nation, right?
Exactly. Up until World War II,
Mm,
Sweden was incredibly homogenous.
really?
One of the sources even said that only about 1% of the population was born outside of Sweden,
Wow.
and even fewer were born outside of Europe.
Oh.
So this idea of Sweden as a multicultural society is actually relatively new.
It's interesting, though, because some sources are trying to reshape that narrative,
Right.
presenting Sweden as always having been a land of immigrants.
Yeah.
They point to groups like the Walloons, those skilled metalworkers from Belgium who came in the 17th century.
The Walloons, right? Their impact on Swedish industry is undeniable.
Oh, for sure.
But they were a small, highly skilled group who were specifically invited to contribute their expertise.
Right.
To compare that with today's situation,
Yeah.
which is largely driven by refugee and family-based migration,
Mm-hmm.
is a bit misleading.
It's like saying that because you had a guest speaker in your class, once your classroom has always been a bustling international hub.
Exactly.
But digging into the history, it seems the biggest immigrant group to Sweden actually came from Finland, right?
Yes, after World War II, there was a wave of labor migration from Europe, particularly Finland,
Mm-hmm.
which had a significant impact on Sweden's demographics. But again, this was a different situation. Many of these Finnish workers eventually returned home,
Okay.
and integration wasn't as much of a pressing issue.
Right.
That wave was driven by economic need, and it was often temporary.
And then, of course, you've got the more recent wave of asylum seekers.
Yeah.
Sweden became a primary destination for people seeking asylum in Europe,
Hmm.
especially after the Syrian civil war.
Yes, and the peak in 2015 saw a record 160,000 asylum applications in Sweden.
Wow.
It's important to note that this influx came at a time when the global economy was shifting, impacting job availability for low-skilled workers everywhere.
Right.
This added another layer of complexity to the integration process.
So even though Sweden has this robust welfare system, integrating such a large number of people so quickly
Yeah.
proved to be really difficult.
Right.
The data you sent shows some pretty stark gaps between native Swedes and immigrants.
Yeah.
Particularly when it comes to employment and wages.
The data really highlights this challenge. Unemployment rates for immigrants from outside Europe are 3 times higher than those for native Swedes.
And even when immigrants have comparable skills, they often struggle to find jobs that match their qualifications.
That's right.
One of the sources mentioned that this might be connected to Sweden's high level of social trust.
Mhm.
Can you explain that a little more?
Sure.
What exactly is social trust, and how might it actually be making integration harder?
Social trust is a fascinating concept.
Hmm.
It's essentially the level of confidence people have in each other, even strangers.
Interesting.
It's a measure of social cohesion.
Okay.
And Sweden consistently ranks very high in global surveys of social trust.
Hmm.
This has many positive effects, but some experts suggest that this high level of social trust
Yeah.
can create unintentional barriers for newcomers.
Okay.
Think of it like a tightly woven fabric.
Yeah.
It's strong and resilient,
Right.
but it can be difficult to add new threads without disrupting the pattern.
So it's almost like their strength, the sense of community and trust, becomes a weakness when it comes to integrating people from outside that community.
Exactly. This strong social cohesion while beneficial in many ways, can make it harder for newcomers to break into existing networks, find jobs, and truly feel like they belong.
Right.
And this brings us to the current paradigm shift in Sweden's migration policy.
Right, because now you have this new right-wing government
Yeah.
backed by the anti-immigration Sweden Democrats making some pretty dramatic changes.
It's important to understand that it's not just about offering money for immigrants to return home.
Okay.
They're also implementing stricter asylum rules, limitations on permanent residency, and a greater focus on deportations.
Got it.
It's a multifaceted approach, and it reflects a broader shift in the political landscape.
It's interesting, though, because Sweden has always presented itself as a moral leader when it comes to humanitarian aid and welcoming refugees.
And that's what makes this shift so intriguing. It's a significant departure from their previous stance, and it's sparking a lot of debate about what it means to be Swedish in the 21st century.
Some of the sources suggest that this open-door policy has led to internal divisions within Swedish society.
Okay.
Is there a sense that maybe the pendulum has swung too far in one direction?
Well, some experts argue that the rapid pace and scale of immigration in recent decades have put a strain on Sweden's social fabric,
Okay.
which has contributed to the rise in anti-immigration sentiment.
Right.
It's a complex and sensitive topic, but it highlights the challenges of balancing humanitarian ideals with the practical realities of managing migration and maintaining social cohesion.
So we've got this historical context of a relatively homogenous society that's experienced a rapid influx of immigrants in recent decades.
Right.
And now we have this political shift towards stricter policies.
Yeah.
There's definitely a lot more to unpack here.
For sure.
Should we start by diving into the economics of this situation?
Absolutely. That's a key piece of the puzzle.
Okay, great.
Yeah. One of the main arguments driving this policy shift is the idea that Sweden can no longer afford its generous welfare system with so many immigrants relying on it.
Yeah, that makes sense. We did see data showing that immigrant unemployment, especially among those from outside Europe, is significantly higher than for native Swedes.
That's right. And if people aren't working, they're more likely to rely on social welfare programs, which puts pressure on the government budget.
So the thinking is that by encouraging some immigrants to leave Sweden can ease that pressure and free up resources.
Precisely, however, as with most things, the economic impact of immigration is a lot more nuanced than that.
Of course, there's always more to the story.
Right. There's a whole school of thought in economics that argues immigration can actually be a driver of economic growth in the long term.
Really? How does that work?
Well, immigrants can help address labor shortages in certain sectors, like healthcare or technology. They often bring new skills and entrepreneurial spirit, which can boost innovation and create new businesses.
So it's not just about the costs. There could be some pretty substantial benefits as well.
Exactly. And it's about finding the right balance between those costs and benefits.
But how do you even begin to measure something like that? The economic benefits of immigration seem pretty hard to quantify.
It definitely presents a challenge for economists. It's difficult to isolate the impact of immigration on economic growth, since it's always happening alongside other factors like global trends and technological changes. But there is a growing body of research that suggests a positive correlation between immigration and economic growth.
So maybe it's less about saying immigration is inherently a drain on the economy and more about acknowledging that it's complicated.
Exactly. It's not a simple issue with a straightforward solution. It really depends on a lot of things. The skills and education level of the immigrants themselves, the needs of the specific labor market they enter, and the government policies that support their integration.
It sounds like there's no one-size-fits-all answer when it comes to the economics of immigration.
That's right. And that's what makes Sweden's policy shift so fascinating. It's a real-world experiment that could provide valuable insights into the economic impact of these kinds of changes.
So we'll have to wait and see how it all plays out.
Exactly. But for now, I think it's important to avoid making sweeping judgments about the economic impact of immigration because it's a multifaceted issue that needs careful and nuanced consideration.
Okay, so we've looked at the history, we've touched on the economics, but we also have to consider the cultural implications of all of this.
Ah, yes, the cultural dimension. This is where things get particularly interesting.
Because Sweden has always prided itself on being such an open and tolerant society, hasn't it?
Absolutely. Their self-image as a humanitarian superpower, a place that welcomes refugees with open arms, is deeply ingrained in their national identity.
And these new policies seem to be at odds with that identity.
To some degree, yes, it's a significant departure from their previous approach, and it's raising questions for a lot of Swedes about what it truly means to be Swedish in this day and age.
Do you think there's a sense that this is a betrayal of their core values?
It's a question many Swedes are wrestling with. Some argue that by tightening their borders and encouraging immigrants to leave, they're abandoning those who need help the most. Others, however, feel that Sweden has done its part, taken in more refugees than it can realistically support, and needs to start focusing on the well-being of its own citizens.
It sounds like a tough dilemma, a real balancing act between compassion and practicality.
It is, and it touches on some pretty deep-seated anxieties around cultural change and national identity.
This isn't unique to Sweden, though, is it? We see these same anxieties playing out in countries all over the world.
It's a global phenomenon. This rise of populism and nationalism is often fueled by fears of cultural change and economic uncertainty, and immigration frequently becomes a focal point for these anxieties.
So it's not just about the actual number of immigrants coming in, but also what people perceive them to represent.
Precisely, they become symbols of these broader social and economic shifts that people are struggling to comprehend and adapt to.
And in a country like Sweden, which historically has been very homogenous, these anxieties might feel even more pronounced.
It's certainly possible the pace and scale of immigration over the last few decades has been unprecedented. It's understandable that some people feel overwhelmed by those changes.
Especially if they feel like their own culture and identity are being threatened.
Which brings us back to the core of the integration challenge.
Right, because if people feel threatened, they're less likely to be welcoming and supportive of newcomers.
Exactly. It creates this vicious cycle where fear and resentment lead to division and make the process of integration that much harder.
It sounds like breaking that cycle takes a real conscious effort to build bridges and foster understanding between communities.
Absolutely. It requires open and honest dialogue, empathy, and a willingness to see things from different perspectives.
And it also requires leadership, right? Leaders who can articulate a clear vision of a diverse and inclusive society.
Exactly. Leadership that inspires hope and confidence in the future instead of fueling fear and division.
Because ultimately, these cultural anxieties are about more than just immigration itself. They're about the kind of society we want to live in and the values we prioritize.
You hit the nail on the head. It's about asking ourselves, do we want a society that is open and welcoming to those who are different, or one that is closed off and driven by fear?
That's a fundamental question that every society has to grapple with, and it's one that Sweden is facing in a particularly stark way right now.
Oh, couldn't agree more.
So we've covered a lot in this deep dive.
Yeah.
You know, the history, the economics, all the cultural anxieties. But I think it's time to zoom out a little.
Okay.
And consider the bigger picture. What are the potential global implications of Sweden's shifting migration policy?
That's an important question because Sweden's decision to move away from its open-door policy could have a ripple effect that extends far beyond its own borders.
Especially considering they were often seen as a model for how to handle migration, right?
Absolutely. Their approach was often held up as an example of humanitarianism and generosity.
Yeah.
And this shift could embolden other countries to adopt similar restrictive policies.
So it's almost like a domino effect.
Yeah.
One country makes a change and others follow suit.
That's certainly a possibility. If Sweden, with its long history of welcoming refugees, is pulling back, it could give other countries the political cover they need to do the same.
Which could then make it much harder for refugees fleeing conflict and persecution to find safety and protection anywhere.
That's the concern. It raises some fundamental ethical questions about the responsibility of wealthy nations to those in need.
It's like we're all retreating into our own little fortresses, shutting out the rest of the world.
In a way, yes. And that creates a more fragmented and divided world, a world where cooperation and solidarity are increasingly rare.
Which ironically makes everyone less safe and secure in the long run.
Exactly, because global challenges like migration, climate change, and pandemics require collective action and cooperation. We can't solve these problems in isolation.
So Sweden's policy shift isn't just about Sweden.
Right.
It's a reflection of these larger trends and anxieties that are shaping the global landscape.
Precisely. It's a sign of the times, a symptom of a world grappling with the complexities of globalization and diversity.
And it raises some tough questions about the future of humanitarianism and international cooperation.
Questions that we all need to be thinking about and engaging with.
This deep dive has really given us a lot to ponder. From the historical context to the economic arguments to the cultural implications. It's a complicated issue with no easy answers.
And it's an issue that will continue to evolve in the years to come.
But hopefully, by having these kinds of conversations, By examining the issue from multiple perspectives, we can begin to find a way forward, a way to balance our humanitarian ideals with the practical realities of managing migration.
Because ultimately the goal is to create a world where everyone has the opportunity to live a safe, dignified, and fulfilling life, regardless of where they were born or what circumstances brought them to a new country.
That's a vision worth striving for, and this deep dive has been an important step in that journey. It's helped us understand the complexities of the issue, challenge our own assumptions, and broaden our perspectives.
And that's what the deep dive is all about.
Thank you for joining us on this exploration, and we encourage you to continue exploring these issues on your own, engage in meaningful conversations, seek out diverse viewpoints, and keep asking those tough questions.
Because it's through those conversations and that continued exploration that we can work towards a more just and equitable world for everyone.
On that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.
Farewell.